All right, hello everyone. My name is Surya Dev. I'm the UN Special Rapporteur right to Development, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you for this virtual dialogue on the topic of development, debt, and degrowth, the role of the Pact for the future. This is an inaugural event under this new series that I'm launching under the banner of Development Dialogues. And the idea is that we bring together different stakeholders to discuss serious challenges that the world is facing around development issues and what solutions we should try to find out working together. Now, with this in mind, the first theme is on development, debt, and degrowth. What kind of a development model should we have that leaves no one behind, that respects the planetary boundaries? That is a key question that the world is dealing with. How debt, especially faced by small developing countries or low income countries, is undermining their potential to realize human rights. And how do we reconcile the idea of degrowth with this idea of development, right to development as well? These are the questions. And how do we situate it in the context of the Pact for the Future that will be adopted in a couple of weeks' time in New York? It is my great pleasure to have a very distinguished panel of experts. So we have Dr. Mariana Alete. She is the Global Advocacy and Development Policy Manager, ACT Alliance. We have Professor Oliver de Schutter, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. We have Her Excellency Patricia Hermans, Ambassador and the Permanent Representative of the Bahamas in Geneva. And last but not least, we have Professor Etienne Vares, UN Independent Expert on Foreign Debt and Human Rights. Thank you everyone for joining. And we are recording this conversation. So I hope that is fine with everyone because a lot of people registered for this event and we would like this conversation to be accessible to them as well. And of course, there is a Q&A at the end of your screen towards the bottom. Please put your questions and I will try to take some questions if I could find time. So without any further ado, let me start with this. And Olivia, if you may start with you first. Are the current development models working for everyone? And are we operating within the planetary boundaries? What do you think?
Well, first of all, thank you, Surya, for organizing these development dialogues. And I very much look forward to our conversation and to the exchanges during the next hour. Let me perhaps try to answer your question by saying that we have traditionally approached the question of poverty eradication and the implementation of economic and social rights more generally using a three-time sequence or a three-step sequence. First, we sought to grow the economy, increase monetary wealth. Second, to tax corporations and wealthiest households in order to finance public services and social protection. And thirdly, we adopted social policies to redistribute wealth and to mitigate inequalities. And that approach has been guided by a policy tool that was the gross domestic product. The measure of the health and performance of the economy was sought in that single indicator: how much monetary wealth are we creating? And I believe that today we are reaching the limits of this model, which to a large extent is still embodied in the Sustainable Development Goals adopted in 2015. The limits we are facing result from essentially three factors. First of all, this growth-centered model of development is leading us to cross a number of planetary boundaries. They are unsustainable from the point of view of our environmental impacts. Secondly, this model of growth has led to policy choices that in fact may have resulted in increasing inequalities, for example, to attract foreign investors, to reduce the regulatory burden on corporations, to reduce the levels of taxation corporate actors are facing in order to encourage them to increase their profits and investments. And thirdly, this model is now failing because inequalities not only are persisting, but are deepened by globalization and the removal of barriers to trade and investment, gradually being seen as a tool to create growth. What I'm trying to explain is that in the name of pursuing growth, we've made a number of policy choices that increase poverty and inequality, and we must therefore think differently.
Thank you. And I will invite all the participants, if you have not yet seen Olivia's report, most recent report, I believe, to the Council on beyond GDP, beyond growth, right, Olivia? So I will encourage participants to look at that. Patricia, as a government representative, how do you see this? Do you think growth is essential to deal with the issues about poverty and the challenges that Olivia highlighted? How do you see it from the government perspective?
I think the point that he raised, and again, thank you for this opportunity to really highlight some of the challenges that we are facing as developing countries. I think it's important to have these conversations because very often the perspective from the countries themselves are missing. And I think that this is a great opportunity for this to be aired. I agree 100% with the perspective regarding the heavy focus on GDP, particularly for small island developing states, the Bahamas being one of them. Give you an example from the perspective of the Bahamas. We're an archipelago, and we are classified as a high-income country. Now, when you take this within the context of 34 islands that are inhabited, there are 700 islands in the Bahamas, and if you take each of those islands individually, some of them will be classified as less developed, LDCs. Most of the GDP is focused on Nassau, which is the capital. And so there is a very uneven distribution of wealth throughout the country, which distorts how we are able to access financing. So we're classified as high income, and therefore, when we go to markets to seek financing, we are not able to get preferential terms. If we desegregate each of our islands, some of them will qualify for concessionary financing, and others, like Nassau, may not. So this concept is something that is very important for us to start focusing on. And as you know, the issue concerning the multidimensional vulnerability index is attempting to bring this into focus and to allow for a more equitable consideration for small island developing states, because the one-size-fits-all GDP, which is really a structure from the north, is no longer valid in the context of small island states like the Bahamas.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for highlighting this. And Atia, you recently, I think last year, visited Bahamas as well. So maybe you could also add some perspectives, because as an independent expert, you observe the situation on the ground, the challenges faced by a small island developing country, but also the point that Patricia made in terms of the borrowing thing. I was looking at the UNCTAD recent report, and it indicated that certain developing countries are borrowing 2 times to 8 times more interest rate as compared to a developed country like US or Germany. And that creates an inherent disadvantage for those countries if they want to develop and go for inclusive growth. So I would give you the floor. And of course, Mariana, will come back to you as well. Thank you.
Yes, well, thank you very much. Yes, I had the honor and the pleasure to visit the Bahamas last year, and of course with Patricia's assistance, absolutely. And one of the things that really struck me was actually the whole issue of climate and climate change, and then the effect that climate has even on the ability of countries to take things forward. So Bahamas was particularly interesting because they had taken on 4 different debts, all related to climate. And they had managed to pay off the first one, and there were 3 more pending. But this was in regard to infrastructure that actually was under the sea. So you have a situation in your debt cycle where whatever you're taking on to build and to develop your country or grow, whichever language you want to use for it, climate has this ability to destroy anything that you're doing, but you're still left holding the bag. You're still left not only paying off the debt, but also the interest rates. And I wasn't able to ascertain if there was actually any moratoriums given or any kind of assessment given that allows countries going through, for example, this kind of extreme climate effect from actually having the time to regroup and then, move forward. And then that takes me also into the whole question of COVID. Well, COVID took place and you haven't seen a recalibration of debt even in those spaces. So agreements on debt that was signed before COVID have continued in place going forward. And there hasn't been a freezing of interest rates or even a reduction of them. And then if I look at the new debt agreements coming in, which are reliant on data, which Patricia also has just referred to, well, they're referring to data that is being projected based on the past. But COVID has literally destroyed our ability to effectively forecast the rate of growth of an economy, the rate of interest rates a country can actually pull together, and how it can pay off its debts. So we're in this extremely fragile point in the lives of most developing countries as we speak right now. And I would also hazard to say developed countries, because climate is affecting absolutely everybody. So you cannot predict any of these directions. And so what you have is a scenario where we're using data that is, it is not reliable. At minimum, I like to use the word guesstimate, not even an estimate anymore, but like a guess. And then trying to get countries to take this forward. And we're still using the old language. We're still using growth language. And we need to shift to this multi-dimensional index that UN DESA has developed, which is actually allowing for multi-vulnerabilities and multi-dimensions that allows us to tailor the ability for countries to move forward. But there is one thing you alluded to, which is the fact that there is this disparity in interest rate payments. I actually just came back from Angola as well on an official visit, and I'm finalizing the report there. And one of the things I noticed there was that when you are successful in paying off your interest rate, especially when it comes to private debt, then the bondholders want a higher amount of interest rate because you're now better for speculation purposes. So you can imagine a country that actually pays off its debt and pays its interest and does everything on time now moves into a different market where interest rates are going to go higher rather than lower because of how successful you are, which is literally counterintuitive when it comes to looking at development, which is of course
I think you're spot on that climate change is definitely going to impact developed societies and countries as well. I think in recent months, for instance, we saw flooding in Dubai airport, But I think there's a difference. The difference is potentially that these developed countries and societies have resources to deal with climate change. That is definitely, they have technology. They have financial resources, so they may be able to manage the impact better than the countries in the global south, for instance, right? And the other issues about polluter pays, right? They have caused the climate change. So I think we cannot ignore that particular dimension. But let me bring in Mariana. Sorry that you had to wait for so long.
I don't agree though, but yes,
we'll come to that. I mean, that is also the idea of this dialogue, that we may disagree. So because if all of us agree on everything, there is not much fun. So Mariana, over to you.
Thank you
if you
so
want
much.
to react to.
Yes, thank you, Surya. Thank you for the invitation and thank you for the fun conversation. I agree with most of what has been said, and I also agree with your point in terms of the disparities between the global north and the global south. And I would bring just two elements here, just to bring this conversation more concretely to what we see on the ground in civil society. All of us normally see and read Oxfam's annual inequality report. This year was no different. I mean, the numbers are quite scary, to say the least. You have 1% of the richest fortunes representing 48% of the world's financial assets, which is appalling. And then when you look at the global north and the global south divide, the global north holds 69% of the world's fortunes, hosting 75% of the fortunes, but only having 21% of the world's population. So again, we do have, for me, there is a very important dynamic when we're looking at what development model that we need, because I think it needs to address historical challenges and current challenges as well. Agenda 2030 is, for me, inadequate because it is very focused on this inclusive, and I say quote unquote growth, which Olivier already alluded to, and his report is absolutely great. I definitely recommend everyone reading it. And this links to other initiatives like the Pact for the Future, and I think we'll get to this at some point, which also uses growth in an adequate way. For me, human rights needs to be put front and centered, and we really need to value, we really need to reassess our values in terms of what sort of development model we want. Because one of the things that has not been mentioned is neoliberalism, and in a way, I would say the model, the GDP-centered model, actually was successful. The problem is just that for whom? It was successful in creating this large wealth to some, leaving the largest part of the world population really struggling in survival mode rather than thriving. And this, for me, is highly immoral. We do have a very important opportunity now that we are reassessing what we want for our shared future and our shared home, our planet. And I do think that definitely challenging what sort of growth and for whom is a crucial part of that.
Thank you for that. So basically, what the consensus seems to be emerging, at least partially, if not fully, is that the idea of the growth that we have, which is the growth for some, GDP, cumulative GDP of a particular country, is leaving too many people behind. So it's not inclusive growth, and the planetary boundaries are ignored. And that goes back to the questions about colonization and neo-colonial policy as well as neoliberal policies. And before we move further and dive a little bit deeper in terms of what transformative shift is needed, Ati, I wanted to give you the floor because it seems you wanted to make a point. So if you take the floor now, and then we'll have another round of conversation. And I would also like to invite the participants, and thank you everyone for joining from different parts of the world. Please use Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to put your questions. And I very much hope to pick some questions from Q&A and bring it to our discussion. Thank you. Atia, you have the floor.
Thank you. So while I don't look at climate and its own self, because if you look at climate just by itself, then you will have a particular position on it. But the world is in a global crisis right now, which means that whether you're in the global north or the global south, you're under pressure. Although we will say that some are more developed and some are less developed, without a doubt. But this pressure, when you deal with now climate, adds a whole new nuance to the entire conversation. And so what's been happening is, for example, the climate funds are empty. If I'm not mistaken, the loss and damage fund only has funding from one country, which is Ireland. So you have a scenario where countries are pledging, but are not honoring their pledges. And the question that comes from that is, do they even have the money? So this is a question we have to ask ourselves, because if they're not honoring the pledges, then what is holding them back? And so they may not even have enough for their own mitigation and adaptation. Unfortunately, it is a question that we have to deal with. And then when it comes to adapting for climate change, I mean, you've given the example of the airport in a country that's a desert country. And the thing about countries that have deserts is that they actually never build drainage for their roads because they don't need it, for example. So you have a scenario in spaces like that where the infrastructure still is not ready. So the infrastructure in the global south is not ready for climate change because it's a change. But similarly, even in the north, it is a pressure point without a doubt. And there is a conversation about why global north countries are not taking on debt to honor their pledges. I just want to stop.
No, I think that's a fair point, that the system, the mechanism may not be ready in the global north developed countries. But my point was slightly different. My point is that if they are not ready, they have the resources, they have the capacity, they have the technology to become ready. They could do it faster than definitely some of the countries. So if we could, it seems there's some challenge, technical issue in Q&A, posting questions. So if that is not working, I will encourage participants to put a question in the chat, and hopefully I'll pick it from there. I would now like to move the conversation to the changes. So what kind of a transformative shift is needed? So the neo-colonial growth-oriented model is not working for everyone. Planetary boundaries are not being respected. The debt is a serious burden for many countries. So what shifts are needed? Not just one shift. What multiple transformative changes must take place? And what is stopping us it from happening? Because I guess we need a political will to change things, right? And maybe there's not enough political will. So who wants to start?
I can give it a go.
Yeah, please go for it.
Well, for me, as I alluded to, human rights needs to be front and center. The protection of human rights and the protection of our planet.
And do you mean, sorry to cut you, but do you mean human rights economy? Because that term you have not mentioned. You are saying human rights at the center and underpin it, but do you really mean that it should be the human rights economy? I want to hear it from you.
Yes, I do mean the human rights economy as framed by the High Commissioner for Human Rights, or also the rights-based economy, as some of us are framing it, but which is the same for me. I'm not attached to a term. I think the goal in itself is how can we create an enabling environment, which actually relates to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, if I'm not mistaken. Article 28 talks about enabling environment. How can we create an enabling environment for the realization of human rights? And the human rights economy, or the rights-based economy, talks about, it's an umbrella term that helps to flourish plural economic models, feminist economies, care economies, social solidarity economies. How can we create an environment where context-specific, inclusive development models arise, to really work within the boundaries that we have, but also cherishing and protecting values that we hold dear, and also protecting public goods, protecting the commons, right? And this is deeply connected to the right to development. When we're talking about education, when we're talking about health, how can we have economic models that protect that? Because currently, the neoliberal economic models are, as we already, as already said, and some of us are alluded to, is failing people and planet. It's completely biased towards large fortunes, large individuals, debt, which is completely unsustainable.
Thank you. Oliver, you want to jump in? And I heard the word democracy, Mariana. So that was interesting, because definitely there are serious democratic deficits. And we could have potentially added this D as well, because this dialogue is about Ds, right? Development, debt, and degrowth. And we could have added democracies as well. Olivier, what would you like to add here?
Well, thank you. So yeah, I think we have to realize that the task is immense to shift from one development model to another. I see two major obstacles that we face beyond the very high levels of debt many countries are facing, forcing them to grow in order for the debt to be sustainable. And once a country is forced to grow to reimburse its external creditors, it is forced to grow in ways that will not necessarily be inclusive, reducing poverty and inequalities. It will grow, for example, by extracting resources from the subsoil, or by trying to attract investors by reducing wages of workers. And so that leads countries into a very unsustainable development pathway. But beyond that, more fundamentally, I think the problem is that we have an economy that essentially uses the resources available to produce what the market demands. And what the market demands is what the richest groups in the population are ready to pay for. And that results in a very inefficient use of scarce resources. We produce many things that are not truly necessary to satisfy the basic needs of the population and to realize human rights.
So
but
will you say, Olivia, sorry, but that's the idea of this dialogue. So will you say tobacco products, soft drinks, or selling water in Europe, selling water in plastic bottles in Europe? Do you think we need that? Because we can drink tap water in Europe, and I often get puzzled that why are we selling water in Europe in plastic bottles?
No, I mean, clearly there are many uses of the resources we have at our disposal that are profitable for the companies that produce these things, but do not correspond to the satisfaction of basic needs of the population. And that is in large part because it's a demand-driven economy, which responds to the purchasing power of the rich. And the second problem is that in the system that we are stuck in, governments depend for their ability to provide services to the population on the health of the private sector. It is by allowing the private sector to thrive that governments can tax profits and finance public services, which allows companies to exercise a form of blackmail on governments if the regulatory burdens are too important or the taxes on corporate profits are set at a too high level. And that places governments in a very delicate position, forcing them to a permanent trade-off between satisfying the needs of the population on the one hand and allowing companies who are meant to create wealth to thrive on the other hand. That, I think, is another major problem. So deviating from this will require much more than what governments today seem to be willing to do, which is to think about new indicators of progress beyond GDP. The draft Pact for the Future provides for this, which is already in target 17, 19 of the SDGs, but that is not enough. It's not sufficient to change the measure of progress if we are not ready to question some fundamental dimensions of the economic models under which we are operating.
Thank you. So we need a fundamental shift, and we'll come to the Pact for the Future, whether it is reflecting that fundamental shift. And I know both Patricia and Atia would like to jump in, but I want to acknowledge some of the input coming from the Q&A as well. So first is that we should not merely talk about climate change, but triple planetary crisis. And I believe all of us agree with that. We are just using climate change as an example, but I think the environmental pollution, biodiversity loss equally is problematic. And this current model of development is destroying the biodiversity. In fact, I have started articulating this idea that when we say leave no one behind, that is problematic because we are talking about only human beings. If we leave behind animals and plants, human beings cannot survive. We cannot leave behind rivers and lakes as well. So we'll definitely come to that. And there's also a question that I would like someone to reflect. I think it's coming from Tricia. Are there any innovative examples of inclusive development? So maybe we'll come back to that question a little later, but I want to give floor to Patricia and then Atia. And if you could be brief, each one of you, then we'll have more conversation. Thank you. Patricia.
Okay. Yes, thank you. I just wanted to speak to the issue of the reset. And I think the reset is very important for us to factor in the fact that there is a need for consideration of how small island developing states with very heavy debt burdens, how this position is resolved. And I look back at the issues that the world came together under the Bretton Woods and the debt forgiveness in Germany at the time, where all countries came together who were part of the UN at that time to come to a solution that will facilitate, which would call the combined advancement of the world post-World War II. And so what we need is a similar kind of consideration to be made, particularly when you take into account the implication of climate change. And I said in other circumstances that the challenge of climate change is equivalent to the challenges that were faced, at least equivalent to the challenges that the world faced at the end of World War II. And so this need for countries to come together to create an environment that will allow for sustainability of all. Back in 1945, there were basically 50 or so persons around the table dealing with these issues. Today, we have over 190. And many of those countries today, the independent countries, the countries, small island developing states, were not even part of the UN system at that point. So we have a complete change in the way decisions will have to be considered, given the fact that we have a broad cross-section of concerns that that create a very complex perspective around how we're able to resolve these issues, especially since those countries, the smaller countries, are not in a position of power and wealth, and how these considerations are taken into account, especially when you consider that they are also countries that are very heavily indebted. How do you bring those two issues together in order to be able to create a position going forward? And to some extent, it requires a ceding of ground to a certain extent by those countries of power and wealth. And this is where I believe the challenge will exist. Who cedes what? And who is willing to give up what? We spoke earlier about this issue of loss and damage. I think it was estimated $100 billion was needed for mitigation purposes. Right now, we have less than 1% of that actually pledged. And we are mired in a situation in terms of the loss and damage fund where the administrative challenges have still to be resolved in order to be able to receive the funds. And then there are questions in terms of how those funds are distributed. So there are some really serious structural problems that exist. And many people look at circumstances that, for example, in certain situations of conflict, where funds, significant billions of dollars of funds are immediately made available by the North. But yet still, in terms of climate change and the issues related to mitigating climate change, after years of conversation, there still is only 1% of amounts pledged, not even yet deposited. So this issue of resolution has to bring with it a certain perspective regarding concession by those of the most powerful toward those of the least powerful.
Thank you. So the reset point that Patricia you made, maybe Atia, you would like to build on that reset point. How realistic is this reset? Because it seems we need that kind of a reset. And I think Patricia did not use this term, but we often now talk about, even UN Secretary General is talking about the reform of the international financial architecture, right? So what changes are needed? And you have been hitting hard at some of these actors, Atia. So maybe you are the right person. How realistic is this reset in terms of the international financial architecture, which is creating those limitations for many countries and, of course, many people, billions of people?
So I have a little good news and then a lot of bad news. The good news is that as of last week, the UN General Assembly finally voted yes and have moved forward on the terms of reference on the creation of a global tax convention. The win for people like me is that they have included the word human rights in it, which was very hard fought, incidentally. But it's for me, a reflection of the fact that the global spaces where finances are held, even though there is constant pressure on countries to respect and promote and protect human rights, are the same spaces where, when it comes time for allocation of finances to allow for the respect, protection, and achievement or realization of human rights, that there is a blockage in that space. And so that takes me to your question was, way forward and the solutions. Well, my report to the General Assembly this year is on a global fiscal social contract. And I make reference, of course, to the phrase human rights economy, which has been being used in numerous spaces across the world. And the reason that I talk about a global fiscal social contract is because we need a reset, exactly what Patricia says. But I'll take what Patricia says one step forward. Not only was Germany forgiven its total debt after World War II, the US and Germany also went into an agreement where they allowed Germany to collect taxes from corporations operating in Germany instead of doing their normal implementation process, which is only pay taxes in the United States. So you had two things happening. You had debt forgiveness and you had a jump start of revenue coming into Germany. Now, this tax convention that has been so hard fought for so long has been trying to level that playing field, that we don't have taxes paid only in one country, but that we share it equally and fairly, depending on where you have an economy taking place. And look at how hard fought this battle is. So international cooperation and assistance is really not happening. And if you look at the current draft on the creation of global architecture, they talk about accelerating the reform and accelerating reform of governance. But if this is how the voting pattern is going to take place at the UN General Assembly, I don't see who is accelerating what. I just see it's the business as usual taking place, because if you look at who voted yes, who voted no, but also look to see who abstained. It's very telling. And for me, this is a real problem. So countries that are pro-human rights, this is the space to now speak your message. Yeah. And we have numerous problems here. We have credit rating agencies only registered in the United States. We have the Bank of International Settlements that holds all banking data, a private company also registered in Switzerland. Uh-huh. So you have a serious case where there is a private control of public information and public data that would even allow us to make decisions on how to reform the architecture. And these are deadly silent spaces. And then if I move to private debt, there's no regulation of private debt.
Yeah. So maybe that will require another dialogue about the private debt. But thank you for highlighting these very complex questions and highlighting some small progress also, because I think we also need some positive news, because otherwise the world looks very gloomy. So definitely this is a positive news coming out of the tax regime. And of course, you're absolutely spot on that 30-something country abstained, but earlier they were voting against. So definitely I agree with you that why are they abstaining? But I see a positive hope that instead of voting against, they are abstaining now. So I think we need to build more political will, I guess. And I think that is also one of the objectives of a development dialogue series, How do we facilitate candid conversations? How do we build coalitions all over the world amongst different actors, that we understand why the common challenges require collective common solutions as well on the part of everyone. And I think this transformation is needed. Now, there are a couple of questions about the loss and damage fund, that how this loss and damage fund is going to work. Patricia, you mentioned about not adequate pledges being made. But there's also a risk that if this loss and damage fund is going to give loans, that is going to make situation worse in terms of debt. So of course, Suparak, if you are listening, you can post a link to my report. My report to the General Assembly just got published. It focuses on climate justice, loss and damage. So I will invite participants to look at that, where I talk about climate justice framework and how this has to definitely change the way we have been talking about loss and damage fund, but whole conversation about some of these issues. Olivia, I want to now bring the conversation to the next level, if I may, in the next couple of minutes, and that is the often perceived conflict between right to development and degrowth. So can we reconcile the two? Because often people tell me that degrowth is a global north phenomenon. These countries have developed, they've exploited the resources, they are sitting on the wealth, they have plenty of resources, they have plenty of everything. They definitely need to degrow. They definitely need to reduce the consumptions and all that. But many people and many countries in the global south, they still have legitimate aspirations to fulfill their basic needs.
Yeah.
And that's why this idea of degrowth is not really consistent with the idea of right to development. I have my views, but I want to start with you.
Thank you, Surya. I think it is a crucial issue. I was, however, extremely pleased to note when I presented my report on eradicating poverty beyond growth at the latest session of the Human Rights Council that the developing countries who took the floor were very much in support of the proposals made in the report. I think it's clear that there is no single model that should be pursued by all countries, regardless of the different circumstances they're facing. And very clearly, the economies of rich countries are obese. In many cases, they have been enriching the rich far beyond what is necessary. And these countries need either to degrow, at least to set for themselves very different objectives defined by human rights and the needs of people in poverty, rather than continued expansion of the economy. Countries in the global south are, of course, in a very different situation. They need to invest more for schools, hospitals, roads, infrastructure, and they need to create wealth in order to achieve this. The problem, however, is that many of these countries have seen their development depend on their ability to export on global markets, have access to the hard currencies that these exports could allow them to have to gain, and therefore their development model has been very much hijacked by the globalization of the economy. And if the rich countries reduce the pace of their growth, or indeed degrow, that will have negative impacts on many low-income countries in the global south. So what we need is gradually to rebuild South-South trade, to have a much more inward-centered development model in the global south, to encourage developing countries to reduce their dependency on exports in order to improve the situation of their population, in order to have a greater differentiation between the development pathways in rich countries and in poor countries in the global south. So I think we have to have these different approaches. I also try to avoid the word degrowth for that reason. Degrowth suggests the idea that we need to reduce the weight of the economy and the amount of production and consumption it provides. In fact, what we need to do is rethink whom the economy serves and what needs it serves to satisfy or not. I prefer the term post-growth, which is a way of saying that we should adopt policies that do not require as a precondition for everything else, as a precondition for progress, that we increase the GDP. So we should think beyond growth as a universal recipe for all. And I do think that different approaches should be adopted depending on each country's circumstances.
I think that's a fair point, but isn't it the case that post-growth is slightly different concept, because that presupposes growth? And because if you have grown to a level, then you're talking about post-growth. But countries in the developing world, they have still not grown there. So post-growth, again, maybe a neo-colonial concept for them, and they may have this suspicion that this is, again, the global north trying to undermine our right to development, you know? my personal view is not very far from your view, and I think I just published a paper as well, co-authored with one of my PhD students. So I call it differentiated degrowth. So I think the developing world, the global south, has to grow. Definitely, everyone has to grow, but they have to grow in a different manner. They have to learn the mistakes that the global north made. But at the same time, global north has to support that differentiated degrowth. And that would mean resetting the debt issue that we have been talking about. That would require technology transfer. Green technologies have to be transferred. And we have seen even in the times of a crisis like COVID, that multinationals are not willing to share their intellectual property rights when people are dying. And climate change is going to result in slow deaths in many situations. So it may not look even that stark, So definitely we need to reset the debt issue, technology transfer, we need financial aid, and we need that political will and vision on the part of leaders in the global south that they can grow, but it has to be more inclusive and sustainable and within planetary boundaries. I don't know if you agree with that kind of a thinking, Olivier, and then I'll turn to other colleagues as well.
So yeah, I've been speaking a lot already. I'll be extremely brief, but I do believe your idea of differentiated degrowth is an important one to pursue. Let me just say this. GDP growth is something which I myself am agnostic about. It can be a good thing, it can be a bad thing. It all depends what you count as part of the GDP. And certainly there are things we need to degrow, for sure, including fossil fuels extraction, financial speculation, or unnecessary production linked to unsustainable consumption patterns. But there are also things we need to grow, such as investments in nurses, doctors, school teachers, hospitals, and public transport services. And I think the challenge really is to decide where we put our resources in, where we invest for what purpose. That is the compass that the human rights economy should provide us with. And whether this results in increasing the GDP or not, I don't care too much about this. I think it's a matter that, of course, is important to calculate the sustainability of the debt service. It's important in macroeconomic models, but it doesn't matter to the lives of people whether the GDP indicator is performing well or not. And economists gradually are now trying to develop macroeconomic models that do without growth in order to overcome that lock-in, if you wish, in our political imagination. But the key question is, where do we put the resources? What do we want to support? And if we support much more the care economy, the social and solidarity economy, that, in my view, is what matters, not whether we increase or decrease the GDP as an indicator.
Okay, I think that's a fair point to move on to. In the last 10 minutes or so, I want to now bring the connection with the Pact for the Future. So we don't have the final text, all the participants and the panelists, but we have close to a final text, it seems, which is going to be launched in a couple of weeks in New York. So Pact for the Future, Mariana, if I could start with you, whether the Pact for the Future is giving us any hope in terms of the shift, the reset, the changes that we are talking about, like big shifts. Do you see a sign of the Pact for the Future giving that vision? Or are we still talking about superficial tweaking and not systemic changes?
Well, I would say the answer wouldn't be yes or no. Wouldn't be positive or negative necessarily. There are glimpses of hope, but they're also very, in my opinion, very complicated terms that are in Rev 3. I actually just read the Rev 3 of Pact for the Future this morning. So one of the problems is that it reconfirms the commitment to Agenda 2030 without problematizing the thorny issues of Agenda 2030, which I already mentioned. There is mention in the preamble of the democratic trends without actually bringing to the forefront the consumerism in the global north. So for me, again, putting the burden of the problem in the global north rather than actually looking at the global north in a comprehensive way. There is an absence of an explicit mention of the principle of human rights principles that are very important, like non-retrogression and the progressive realization of human rights. There is a mention, and this is a positive one, getting to hope and positivity. There is the mention of the historical inequality, but no mention of colonization explicitly, which for me is a missed opportunity. On paragraph 28, there is a mention of inclusive economic growth, which I think we are all getting to the conclusion it's inadequate. There is a mention on paragraph 37 on beyond GDP, which I think it's positive. I definitely agree with Patricia and Atia when they are talking about the multi-vulnerability index. There are issues that are complicated in terms of terms that are, let's say, buzzwords, like the feminization of poverty, which scholars like Sylvia Chant and Maxime Mourier have already mentioned that might just increase the burden on women. But I won't get there because I know we don't have time. And then lastly, the 2 points, there is no shift of the unequal UN structures, which for me is a big open missed opportunity, like the challenges we have, the UN Security Council, and then no mention of the human rights economy, I believe, which even within the UN system, like the High Commissioner for Human Rights, have been a lot of initiatives, a lot of discussions on that.
Thank you. Thank you for flagging some of these issues. And of course, we don't have enough time. And this is something I knew that when we thought we will deal with such major issues in 60 minutes, I did not anticipate that we will cover exhaustively everything. But the idea was to start the conversation around these issues, and hopefully we'll continue with that. There are a couple of questions that I just spotted. One is about the development idea being community-based. Because often in my experience, and I hope colleagues will agree with that, I find very top-down model of development where international financial institutions or the government officials or UN agencies are sitting in 5-star hotels in capitals and deciding, oh, that is how development should look like. And then they consult the people, not allow them to participate, just consult symbolically. And I think that has to change. That's why I'm pushing, as part of my mandate, this idea of a planet-centered participatory model of development. And maybe that may also link nicely with, Olivier, what you were saying earlier about the South-South trade, the solidarity economy that we're talking about, buying and growing locally, those kind of things, right? Because these global supply chains are also inherently problematic. We haven't talked about those issues, but those are the challenges. And of course, the Pact for the Future also has a declaration appended to it that is about the rights of the future generations. Declaration on the rights of future generations, and of course that is again going to be quite crucial document, though it hardly mentioned the rights of the future generations, which I personally find problematic. But I'm conscious of the time. So I want to go back to Patricia and Atia before we wrap it up. Any final thoughts in terms of what the world should do differently? Patricia, I will start with you.
Well, I was thinking and listening to the various comments. The issue of vulnerabilities, and for example, in the Bahamas, the lack of diversification, the heavy reliance on imports, these things further complicate the issues that have been raised in terms of South-South because of the fact that the lack of diversification is impacting our ability to properly develop. So, for example, in the case of the Bahamas, with tourism being our primary revenue source, issues like the pandemic where no one travels, or issues relating to climate change and the implications of destruction in the islands that prohibit travel to countries. All of these issues kind of work against some of the concepts that we are considering, because we are highly vulnerable. And in the context of climate change and in the context of South-South trade, where countries don't have much in terms of physical trading other than, say, financial services or tourism, the solutions become a little bit more complicated. And so I wanted to put that out as a point of consideration, because it is in some cases, for example, the Bahamas benefits from being near the countries of high wealth, and the extent to which that wealth is therefore shifts in some ways or the other also puts us at the mercy of how we are generating revenue as a country. So it is to us, it's a very complex challenge, and so you know, the solutions in terms of the Pact for the Future, in terms of sustainability, the point that you raised, Surya, relating to the countries withholding, the wealthy countries not wanting to share in cases like in the case of the pandemic on intellectual property, you know, the self-interests, these make it very challenging for decisions to be made as to how the small island developing states and other small economies are given a fair chance to really advance.
Okay. Atia, before I give you the floor for 1 minute, I want all four of you to think one single word that you want to finish with. What must change? Try to think of one single word that will capture your idea of the change. And as you are thinking, I give the floor to Atia, and then we'll try to wrap it up. And my apologies to all the excellent questions and comments in the Q&A and box. My apologies, we could not capture everything. I just read another observation from Luke that the backlash against the idea of human rights economy, it could be even developed countries and economies, you know. Some people may think it's a zero-sum game. Anyway, Atia, 1 minute. Sorry.
No. Okay, well, I'm going to say my one word first, which is 3 words, which is we need to have a global fiscal authority. And that sums up what I want to intervene on, which is basically that we are having a backlash on human rights right now because there is a push from the global south to recognize that rights require resources, financial resources, and that human beings who are the producers of that economy or finance or resource should be producing for the purposes of making sure that it helps them and their environment, which is a link to the planetary argument that you made right at the beginning, Surya. But in addition to that, I have to say there are numerous examples in the chat box, but the one from Progressive International is also very important, and it's really worth looking at as an alternative system. And the biggest problem we're facing right now is that the world is becoming more fragmented and not less fragmented on fiscal spaces. So you have what is now being perceived, some use the word racism, others will say discrimination in the economic system that we have in the world today, where there is a different method of treatment for different countries. I couldn't stop without saying that because I've been hearing it a lot in my spaces. So there is no neutral fiscal space, which is why I have been calling for a global fiscal authority, which is as neutral as possible, where you have access to data, where credit rating is done at a more in a neutral space and data is held there, where if you have a disagreement—
Probably we'll do one more webinar on that.
With a global, yes, if you have a problem with a debtor or a creditor, there's a place to go to. We don't have this, and that is why we are fighting in so many levels. Thank you.
Sorry, Atia. So one word, Olivier.
The democratization of economic decision-making, I think, should be key.
Okay. So I take this one sentence as one word. Thank you. Mariana.
I would say disruption of neoliberalism.
Disruption. Very good. Patricia.
I say collaboration.
Collaboration. Okay. All right. And I will say youth, because I see a lot of gloomy situation in the world. And if I see hope from the youth in different parts of the world. They are thinking differently, and they're willing to put their future at stake to fight for the common values that all of us leadership should be fighting for. So thank you everyone for joining this fascinating discussion. Thanks to all the panelists. Thank you to my team. Thank you to all the participants. We will try to share the recording as well. And my apologies once again, time was not enough, but I hope we'll have more such conversations in person as well, hybrid as well. This is just the beginning. And I very much hope that we can build some consensus for this transformation that we have been talking about. Take care. Bye for now, and watch out for further development dialogues. Thank you, everyone.